Progress. And Laurence, I'll hand over to you for your introduction.
Aaron, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for agreeing to a slightly more extended discussion this week. I thought some really very interesting questions came up both in the Slack group and in discussion last week that I thought it would be worth us just spending a little time on. So today is, to some extent, something of a detour. But in another way, it's a detour in order to maintain our focus. I'm going to suggest that the important detour that we have to make is in the direction of Hegel. And the reason for that is, you will recall that two people in particular last week raised the question of the I in Heidegger. I think two people actually said there is no I in Heidegger. And I want to address that directly and how that works, not as a way of avoiding Andrew Solomon's excellent questions, but actually as a way of answering them. So if I could just begin with this quote, which was Richard Polt and I have been having a series of exchanges. And he sent me this quote, which it was supposedly was made by Heidegger to Medard Voss, I think on an airplane in the early 1960s. And it's recorded late on in volume 89. Volume 89 is the volume of called Zodikona Seminare. It's vast. And it was, when it came out, it was absolutely not what everybody was expecting. It was material people, I think, didn't even know existed. And this is what Voss records Heidegger as having said, and Heidegger went over it and corrected it himself. So it made sure that it was correctly spontaneous, as it were. Heidegger says, entscheidend, it's decisive, or it's crucial to understand the having been, das Gewesensein, not as a mere shadow of the presence, sondern als ein gerade Anwesen, but as straight presence, full, directly as presencing, you can, however you want to translate that. Aus einen vollen Modus der Anwesenheit, as a full mode of presence. As much presence as the present itself, ebenso Anwesenheit wie die Gegenwart. And then Heidegger says, sonst bleibt man im Seinsverständnis der ablaufenden Jetztpunkte. Otherwise, one remains in the understanding of time as the running past, ablaufenden, as the running past and expiring now points. Now, why would I want to bring this before you at the beginning? Because it seems to me that this, to some extent, addresses the question that Andrew posed to us. If I've understood Andrew's questions correctly, I'm going to, I distilled them out of what appeared in the Slack group. Andrew asks two things. Does Heidegger accept that the goal is to understand these thinkers as they understood themselves? And then Andrew qualified that and expanded it by saying, does approaching Heidegger's text mean approaching Heidegger's text less as an exposition of the thought of Heraclitus than as an exposition of Heidegger's own thought? Now, I thought that these two questions taken together are extremely important, not least because although they are sharp and very distinct, nevertheless, and I know this from Andrew's very consistent presence with us, they're clearly asked from a sympathetic place. And they're asked because they are the questions that I think many, many students I've found in my own experience of teaching are asking. And the question then is, what is the link to the I, to this assertion that there is no I in Heidegger? When we ask about the past, when we ask about the Gewesensein, the what was or what has been, what was, what therefore is not present to us now, and yet here we have Heidegger telling us it's fully present, or rather, we need to find a way for it to be fully present. when we ask about this, we ask about what was related then and how we were related to it then, in the same way that we ask about its relation to ourselves now. These things need to be put together. One immediate answer in asking the question whether we are going to understand, let's say, Heraclitus as these thinkers understood themselves, is to say, well, doesn't this lock us into, in a certain way, into the subject-object distinction? Or if you want to press that in the direction that those who are very fond of French theory have pressed us, and this came up in a day conference that Aaron organized last year, that, as it were, we can never properly understand, or we should not even infer, the authorial intention of an author in addressing the text that she or he puts forward. This I find extremely problematic. It's not problematic from the point of view of discerning the author's intention, but rather it's problematic from the point of view of where does the thought come from? At what point does the thought arise? This always gets asked within the subject-object distinction as, for whom does the thought arise? Or even, in whom does the thought arise? So that we think of thoughts as things that thinkers have. We've already encountered in GO 55 very clearly explained that what we are attempting to address is the Zudenkende. The Zudenkende in German is an odd construction, but it implies something coming towards us, or rather something that is, at least in some way, slightly futural. It has a futural aspect. We recall, therefore, and Alberto has been directing our attention quite rightly in the Slack group right up until we began today, back in the direction of some of the questions of Sein und Zeit, being and time. And it's from that perspective that I want to try and address these questions today. So why Hegel? If we take this question, or this assertion, there is no I in Heidegger, we have to ask, how did this suggestion arise in the first place? There is a certain way of teaching nowadays that, if you like, erects fences, that says, well, that thinker doesn't allow that anymore, so we can no longer go there. So Heidegger is no longer a thinker of subjectivity, therefore there is no Ich denke, or I think, as there is for Kant in Heidegger, and therefore there is no I in Heidegger. You get something of the same thing that you get, for instance, when we teach Kant. I was taught Kant in philosophy in the 1980s, that for Kant, being is not a predicate. If you go and interrogate ChatGPT, and many people have been enjoying torturing ChatGPT recently, I asked it, does Kant ever say that being is a predicate? And it said absolutely emphatically no. And I said, are you really sure? And it said yes. And I said, are you really, really sure? And it then spilt out about 3 paragraphs to tell me that no, Kant said that being is not a predicate. Generations of philosophy students grew up thinking that you could never say that being was a predicate. There's one problem with that. Kant never said being is not a predicate. He said being is not a real predicate. In fact, in 2 places, one in the First Critique and one in an essay of 1763, Kant says being is a predicate. In fact, in the essay of 1763, which, as you know, is a pre-critical essay, but in fact, the sections from the First Critique that say being is not a real predicate are quoting the essay of 1663 in many places. Kant says, of course, being is a predicate. In fact, it's a predicate, provided we use it in the right way, that we may use, he says, with little trouble. So why, as it were, has a fence been erected around the idea that being is not a predicate? Because nobody ever asked what Kant meant when he said being is not a real predicate. In fact, if you look a few sentences forward from where he says in the First Critique, being is not a real predicate, he makes a distinction between real and logical predicates. And then he says, pretty much anything can be a logical predicate. Even the subject itself can be a predicate, he says. So being can be a predicate. The same, to some extent, is occurring when we say things like, there is no I in Heidegger. In fact, there is an I all over Heidegger. So let me give you an example of a text from exactly this period, written in 1942. Heidegger on Hegel, however, that the human being is a self and is able to say I and knows of itself and has self-consciousness has always been known by Western thinking. Pretty decisive. He then goes on to say, and this is very relevant for us, Heraclitus says, fragment 101, I have, pursuing myself, listened into it. Fragment 101 says, edisisamen, I can't do the diphthong, emeoeton. I have, pursuing myself, listened into it. He actually cites Heraclitus in the asserting of the I. If we go back to this quote that Richard Polt put before me, it is crucial to understand the Gewesensein, what has been, not as a mere shadow of the present, of the present, but as straight presencing, a full mode of presence, just as present as the present. Otherwise, one remains in the understanding of the time of time as expiring now points. We begin to see what is at issue here. The question is not whether or not there is an I. The question is in what order the I stands. Now, if you are Kant, and I quoted that essay of 1763 for a reason, where Kant says being is not a real predicate. What Kant is asserting in that essay is that everything is dependent on the subjectivity of the subject. The text in question is the only possible proof of the existence of God, where Kant says even the assertion that God is in a way dependent as a positing of the subjectivity of the subject. The essay says it is possible for the individual to prove to him or herself that God is. And in fact, he says every subject should undertake a proof, but it is not necessary to do so. He's making a very simple point. Whether or not you have a proof of God makes absolutely no difference whatsoever to whether or not God is or God isn't. You cannot make the existence of God dependent on the proof itself. But nevertheless, the proof may lead you down a path of self-understanding with respect to the existence of God. That's a separate question, far away from what we are trying to understand today. Section 7 of GA 55, which we're reconsidering in this session, has a sequence of discussions of different understandings of the history of being in its latter part. Each of these is posited or put forward for us, as it were, not posited may be the wrong word, put forward as a point of presence. The question is, what binds them together? Now, why would Heidegger have done this in this section? He does this in order to introduce us to the idea that each thinker, as it were, when she or he thinks, is attempting to think through how presence thinks. The mistake that I would suggest, often make is that we transpose this how into a what. That is to say, we look for the content. And so for those of us, for many of us who've been graduate students, we loved to slice up the history of this or that discipline into its individual persons or individual thinkers, and then turn that thinker into an adjective. And so we say that this is Hegelian, or that is Kantian, or this is Cartesian, or that is Leibnizian, or whoever it is we happen to have been reading at that point. And Heidegger's question, it seems to me, both in the Heraclitus lectures as a whole and in the questions that Andrew has posed to us, is how is the how of what is given in understanding given? In other words, it's not the whatness, it's not the specificities of what the presence is, but rather to understand being, to understand how being is, to understand how we are within being, is to understand the howness in each case that unfolds. And if we ask the question in this way, then as it were, a certain collapsing takes place, because we are asking about the how of presence with respect to the how of presence of Heraclitus, let us say, or of Hegel, let us say. Now we can take each one of these thinkers that thinks certain thoughts, as a kind of now point. And now points come towards us and then they disappear again. They rush past, they rush off us. If you're familiar with Heidegger's discussion of the Aristotelian understanding of time, it takes place, I can think of at least 3 places, but possibly 4 in his oeuvre where this is discussed at some length. Heidegger makes the point that every time we speak about now points, we posit the thinking of a thinker, exactly as the subjectivity of the subject posits thoughts that come up, as it were, within a thinker. Now, it might be wrong for us to posit subjectivity as belonging to Aristotle, although we tend to read Aristotle as if he had first read Descartes, at least to a certain extent. Or rather, it becomes difficult to remind ourselves that Aristotle had not read Descartes. But even Heidegger points out that the understanding of time as a series of now points that is counted is, as Aristotle precisely said, counted within a soul, the psyche, within, therefore, the mind, so that time becomes the succession of moments that minds experience. Why am I going so far around the houses in order to try and illustrate something with respect to the I? Let me turn to some more expository lectures of Hegel to try and illustrate what I think is at work. And this is therefore my detour. In his 1930 lectures on Hegel, Heidegger takes the example, and by the way, behind this, the reason for doing this is precisely in finding this text in 1942, which is exactly parallel to the time period in which the lectures in GA 55, the Heraclitus lectures, were given, is because I think there is a fundamental connection here between Heidegger's reading of Heraclitus and Heidegger's reading of Hegel. We forget very often the extent to which Heidegger is confronting Hegel. Now, this confrontation with Heidegger, this Auseinandersetzung, as it were, is not a hostile confrontation in the sense that it's either looking to agree or disprove, but rather Heidegger thinks that Hegel has brought thinking to a certain pinnacle, which both needs to be understood and also needs to be explained. It's going back into Heraclitus, going back into Parmenides, going back into Anaximander, that provides us with the very basis and possibility of explaining where Hegel ended up, in order then, as Aaron has reminded us on several occasions, that we can, as it were, proclaim the end of philosophy. The end of philosophy is what Heidegger had proclaimed in 1922, and he proclaimed it again in 1932 in the Anaximander and Parmenides lectures. And certainly the Heraclitus lectures also stand in that tradition. So in the 1930s lectures, Heidegger uses the example of writing on the board in the afternoon during the lecture. Now it's the afternoon. Heute ist nachmittags. And then he says, tomorrow morning, the janitor will come in and will look at the board and see, heute ist nachmittags. And in no sense can the janitor agree. He said, in fact, the janitor will go to the stake to prove that heute, it's not afternoon at all, but because now it's the morning. The janitor is the first one in the building, and he's there to make sure the building is opened up and serviceable for the day, and therefore it cannot possibly be afternoon. Now, Heidegger uses of this transition from the afternoon to the following morning two words. One word is the word that we've already heard in the quote from The Aeroplane of 1963, where Heidegger says this is a jetzt, a now, and therefore as a jetzt and a now, it's a Jetzt-Punkte. But he uses one other word, which is absolutely crucial for us to understand what is going on. He says, as a Jetzt-Punkte, this is ein Seiender. He uses both ein Seiendes, and he uses das Seiende of this Jetzt-Punkte. Now, why would that be? We want to translate ein Seiendes as a being. You've heard me go on about this before. And we therefore presume that a being is this thing here. But an afternoon, in that sense, is not like a cup, or a lectern, which is the example that he consistently uses, or anything else that has an object character. Indeed, it's difficult even to think of an afternoon as an object as such. We might say the object of this afternoon's discussion is, but the afternoon is the context, not the object itself. This is something that's been overlooked, I think, in many explanations of what we've nevertheless breezily at various times called the ontological difference, the difference between das Sein and das Seiende. But there it is in the text. The afternoon is both a Jetzt and ein Seiendes, and as ein Seiendes, it has the character of das Seiende. So what on earth could be going on? You'll recall that last week I went on at some length about what I thought had been, in fact, I'm sure it still is, a mistranslation in the text, where quite early on in section 7, Heidegger says that the human being makes a light of himself for himself in lighting up his cities. I want to try and illustrate how that works, but from the point of view of understanding these Jetzt-Punkte as expiring now points, whose unity in some sense has to be understood. Because when we understand the unity that can be understood, we have, I think, the possibility or the grasp to answer Andrew's questions. So if an afternoon, if an afternoon, as it were, can be both a Seiendes and it can at the same time be a Jetzt-Punkt, then it looks very like that it stands in some kind of succession. You'll recall that the first fragment that Heidegger spent a great deal of time on in GA 55 is the to me du non pote, that which never sinks away. And what became clear in that which never sinks away is that in some sense, it is an I self. And that's why I became somewhat nervous when last week we decided that we wanted to assert to ourselves that there is no I in Heidegger. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to just quote some of the sections from the 1930s lectures on Hegel that I think explain what's going on. Heidegger says in the 1930s lectures that whatever we are intending towards discloses both our I focus and the thing itself at one and the same time, and that this is the phenomenological basis for the subject-object distinction. But we're Heideggerians, let's say, at least for the afternoon, and so we don't want to admit that there's anything like a subject-object distinction. So Heidegger replies to us, well, if you want to think in the way that I think, then you are going to have to understand on what the subject-object distinction stands. And this is what he says in relation to Hegel. I'm going to use the English translation because it'd be too difficult to, and I don't want to, I'm just going to use it straight because otherwise I'll drive you mad with retranslating some of the terms. The force of the truth of the sense certainty thus lies in the I, in the immediacy of my seeing and hearing and so on. Is sense certainty, and that's a quote from Hegel, is sense certainty, Heidegger asks, true by virtue of the activity of intending, by virtue of the fact that I grasp as mine what is seen and heard in sensibility, and take both into my seeing and hearing? For Hegel, intending does not signify so much being directed at what is intended as to take up into the intention, i.e. receiving. He means percipi, therefore, in the Leibnizian sense, taking back into the receiver what is received, recipere. Since in seeing and hearing each I intends and takes into its own only what it has seen, each I comports itself quite immediately without letting itself be disturbed by anything other than what is seen. What he's saying here, therefore, is that when I look at the lectern, I see the lectern. And then in another example he gives earlier on, it's exactly, in fact, the point where he talks about the janitor. He says, when I turn round and have my back to the lectern, I carry on seeing, but the lectern disappears. This is exactly what Heraclitus means by the to me dunon pote, by that which never sinks away. There is a sense in which when I am looking out and looking on, I'm never off. I can't turn this off. Even when something terrible happens, I can't turn this off. I can look away, but I'm actually continue to intend what I'm looking away from, so that I then might peek back at it through my fingers. Either, let's say, at best a horror movie, or at worst a terrible accident one was seen on the road. Heidegger then goes on to say, to ask the question, well, if I am doing this, what does the I mean? And he then says this: each I intends what is its own, and what is intended is what is its this I. This is what is this. I, this, affirm the lectern as the here. An engineer in the railway station affirms the engine as the here. And so does each person and every I affirm with the same right and in the same manner of verification, namely by appealing to the fact, immediately and without further ado, that the I takes only its own. So he then asks, well, what is really going on here? And he then says this: precisely because each is true with the same right and in the same manner as any other, this intending, none can claim a priority over the other. On the contrary, each intending denies the rights of the other with equal right. So here we are all looking at something or looking away, as it were, but wherever we are looking is where we are looking. And this, it jostles along, as it were, all together in the same room or the same Zoom chat session or whatever. He adds, they mutually destroy each other and force each other to disappear. They do this by contributing, each intending for itself in each case, to the building of a manifold. If, as it happens, we look at this silent war of each intending against every other, then we find that in this war, the intendings wipe each other out. But insofar as this disappearance is just what it is, something remains. What is manifold, the many of the singular intending and of the singular eyes, this manifold is what disappears. And what is simple is what lasts. What is simple is that which does not let itself be pulled away into the manifold. What is simple is that which is the simple intending in each singular I intend. and is the I in each singular I intend. When I say something which everyone else can say, because everyone else is an I, everyone is that which I say when I say I. That which everyone is, this simple thing, does not lie immediately in every intending. Rather, everyone is immediately, in every case, everyone, a manifold. I hope you see the parallel between this text, which is commenting on a line of Hegel's, and the commentary in section 7, which talks about the light, as it were, which we focus, we turn ourselves into, and which nevertheless overshines or blots out the singular lighting up, which is the being itself. That which is simple, Heidegger says, exists for us only when we pull back from the manifold, when we look carefully to see what remains when the manifold forces itself to disappear. We keep an eye on what disappears and look upon and follow what lasts. We comport ourselves as mediating between both. When we mediate, we find what is simple. The I and the intending, this universal, wherein we presume the force of the truth of sense certainty to be, is also nothing immediate. There are huge parallels in this text with other important texts. This is a full frontal attack on the Cartesian method of doubt, but it's also an attack on the notion that sense certainty guarantees immediate truth. The point, Heidegger's point is that the manifold is what is true rather than the immediate sense. Now, this is a troubled point in contemporary thinking. A lot of contemporary thinking is wanting to privilege certain kinds of experience over other kinds of experience, so that direct experience guarantees a certain kind of truth. Heidegger shows from this passage alone that that is at least questionable, if not in fact highly probable, that what always needs to be taken account of is not the individual intending, but rather the manifolding of the manifold within the simplicity of its unity. Now, I've gone on for at some length, and I'm anxious not to test your patience too much. So I want to come right back to the very beginning, which is Andrew's questions. We could focus on the question of what we think classicists or philologists are doing when they're handling these texts. I know that Aaron Turner spent a great deal of time on that, and I don't want to foreclose anything he might want to say. But the question here is not whether or not we can think what Heraclitus thinks, but rather whether the how of Heraclitus's thinking is also the same how that manifests itself in our own thinking of thinking. So that when Andrew says, does Heidegger accept that the goal is to understand these thinkers as they understand themselves? My suggestion would be that what Heidegger's response really is that the goal is to let the single unity of the how, the simple of das Sein, as we called it, unfold the manifold within which both Heraclitus and we can appear. If we can do that, then we are beginning to think. And then Andrew asks, does approaching Heidegger's text mean approaching it less as an exploration of the thought of Heraclitus than as an exposition of Heidegger's own thought? And this is where I want to end. I think that Heidegger is least interested of all in Heidegger's own thought. In fact, in several places, he's quite careful to say, I didn't put forward my own understandings of what I thought was going on. I was trying to let be seen what I thought was there to be seen. If we want to understand this relationship between aletheia and lanthanomai, between aletheia and lethe, That is what is being named here. That this is what, as it were, unfolds us in each case. Alberto Moreras last week pointed us towards the possibility of there being two ontological differences, the difference between Sein and Seiender, and the difference between Sein and Sein und Seiender. And whilst I would love to agree with him, I don't think that's what's going on. What Heidegger is in each case trying to do is he's trying to lead us back to the originary point that lets unfold. But the originary point, das Sein itself, if you want to call it that, or Wahrheit des Seins, if you want to understand this, as it in its relation to how aletheia unfolds from the concealed, allows us to see not divisions or distinctions, but what divides from out of what previously unifies, so that we get at least a glimpse of the unity that lets division and the manifold unfold in each case. Our goal, therefore, is not to think as Heraclitus thinks, nor even to think as Heidegger thinks, but rather to let thinking be thought, to let the thinking of the Zudenkende, which comes towards us, unfold the worlding of world itself, das Seiende, if you like, the immediate thinking. So I'll leave you with one last point, because tome non pote, the never sinking away, does nevertheless at certain points sink away. Where I would be in full agreement with those who said last week there is no I in Heidegger, is where they are pointing towards Heidegger's difference with Kant, that as it were, the manifold, or whatever is merely secured on the Ich denke of the subjectivity of the subject. That which never sinks away also, at various times, goes to sleep, and then he or she, well, me actually, and you, wakes up. And insofar as we are asleep, we live in the world in a different way. We don't disappear, we dream, or sometimes we don't remember our dreams, and sometimes we wake up from a sleep as if it's the deepest chasm into which we've fallen, which we almost have to crawl our way out of. But nevertheless, this in itself, this being awake and falling asleep, and you'll recall that one of the Heraclitean fragments speaks of sleep, this being awake and falling asleep divides time up precisely into Jetztpunkte, without necessarily them being the Jetztpunkte that are self-consciously divided up and then counted by the self-conscious mind, or the psyche of Aristotle. What Heidegger is always trying to relate us to is the absolute concreteness of the being that we actually are. Not the physicalities, but rather the physicalities themselves let us into the seeing and thinking of what is there to be thought. So I don't know if I've managed to answer this as Andrew might have hoped I would answer it. And I hope that we can have some discussion about that. But rather, I've wanted to put before you what I think are the considerations that are at least there for Heidegger, and I hope should be there for us in trying to think this through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence. I'm just going to stop recording.